You were the one person the avoidant could not break, and it terrified them because their patterns work through breaking people gradually, through eroding boundaries until boundaries disappear, through wearing down standards until standards lower enough that patterns become acceptable, through exhausting resistance until resistance transforms into accommodation that allows patterns to continue without consequence. You did not break. Your boundaries remained intact, despite persistent pressure to eliminate boundaries. Your standards stayed firm, despite consistent messaging. Those standards were too high. Your resistance to unacceptable treatment persisted despite exhausting campaigns to make you accept treatment as normal or reasonable or just how they are. The inability to break you terrified them. Because breaking people is how patterns maintain themselves across relationships, is mechanism through which avoidant secures accommodation that lets patterns continue, is process that transforms partners from people with needs and boundaries and standards into people who suppress needs and eliminate boundaries and lower standards to levels where patterns no longer trigger consequences. When you refuse to be broken in ways previous partners were broken, the avoidant encountered threat. Their defensive system was not designed to handle. Faced reality. Their patterns could not secure indefinite accommodation. Recognized that maintaining relationship with you would require changing patterns rather than changing you. Your unbreakability manifested in specific ways that each terrified them differently. You maintained boundaries they could not manipulate, away, even when manipulation had worked on everyone else. You did not lose yourself despite patterns designed to require self-abandonment as price of staying. You left before they could discard you, which reversed power dynamic they relied on to feel safe. Your strength exposed their patterns as problem when patterns depend on appearing reasonable. You refused to accept their reality as only reality which threatened control they maintained through determining what was real. You held them accountable in ways others did not, which prevented escaping consequences through blame. Your unbreakability proved patterns would not work long-term, with anyone strong enough to resist being broken. Understanding that you were a person they could not break reveals why they behaved more intensely with you than with previous partners who broke more easily. Why relationship ended more dramatically than relationships that ended through slow erosion. Why they think about you more than people who accommodated until accommodation became identity. You were a threat their patterns could not neutralize. Mirror their defenses could not distort. Force their defensive system could not overcome. The terror you created through refusing to break was terror of facing that patterns were problem, that change was necessary, that someone existed who would not accept them as they are when as they are means defended and distant and destructive. Number 1. You maintained boundaries they could not manipulate, away, even when manipulation had worked on everyone else. The avoidant is terrified by you because you maintained boundaries they could not manipulate, away, even when same manipulation tactics had successfully eliminated boundaries with every previous partner, even when pressure that broke others failed to break you. Even when techniques that made boundaries seem unreasonable or selfish, or evidence of not really loving them, did not make your boundaries budge. You held boundaries about treatment you would accept, about behavior you would tolerate, about standards relationship needed to meet. The holding terrified them because boundaries limit patterns, because boundaries require adjustment they did not want to make, because boundaries existing meant relationship would end when patterns violated boundaries. They tried standard manipulation approaches that had always worked before. They criticized boundaries as you being too demanding or too rigid or too controlling. They framed boundaries as evidence you did not love them enough to accept them as they are. They positioned boundaries as your problem rather than their patterns being problem boundaries protected against. They compared you to previous partners who did not have such boundaries, implying previous partners loved them better. Because previous partners accepted patterns, your boundaries prevented you from accepting. The manipulation failed. Your boundaries remained. The failure terrified them. Your maintaining boundaries despite manipulation meant they could not secure the boundaryless relationship their patterns require to operate without consequence. Could not create dynamic, where they withdrew and criticized and blamed without boundaries stopping those patterns. Could not maintain control through violating you in ways boundaries prevented. The boundaries forced choice between respecting boundaries by changing patterns or losing relationship by continuing patterns that boundaries did not permit. The choice terrified them, because neither option felt safe, when safety to them means maintaining patterns while keeping relationship. Subscribe to understand why you were the one person the avoidant could not break, and how your unbreakability created terror. Their defensive system was not designed to handle. The terror also came from recognizing boundaries revealed their manipulation as manipulation, rather than as reasonable responses you should accept. When manipulation does not work, manipulation becomes visible as manipulation. When boundaries do not move despite pressure, boundaries reveal pressure as inappropriate, rather than boundaries being inappropriate. Your boundaries, holding exposed their tactics, made them see themselves employing manipulation. They could pretend was not manipulation when manipulation succeeded in eliminating boundaries. The exposure terrified them. The seeing themselves clearly terrified them. Your unbreakability forced recognition their pride could not tolerate. Number 2. You did not lose yourself despite their patterns designed to require self-abandonment as price of staying. The avoidant is terrified by you because you did not lose yourself, despite their patterns being specifically designed to require self-abandonment as price of staying in relationship. Despite accommodation demands that made previous partners disappear themselves to maintain relationship, despite pressure to suppress needs and eliminate boundaries and accept non-reciprocity that successfully eroded previous partners until partners no longer recognized themselves, you stayed yourself. Your needs remained visible even when expressing needs triggered withdrawal. Your self persisted, even when maintaining self meant conflict about you being too much or too needy or too demanding. They are accustomed to partners gradually losing themselves through accommodation process, to people who start with needs and boundaries and standards, slowly suppressing needs and eliminating boundaries and lowering standards, until what remains is shell-accommodating patterns, rather than person requiring reciprocity. The process usually works invisibly as partner adapts, bit by bit, believing adaptation is compromise rather than self-abandonment. You did not adapt in ways that eroded you. You did not compromise yourself out of existence. You stayed whole while they expected you to become hollow. Your maintaining yourself, despite patterns requiring your disappearance, terrified them. Because your self-existing meant patterns could not operate freely. Meant your needs created expectations they could not meet. Meant your boundaries prevented behaviors. Patterns rely on. Meant your standards highlighted their inadequacy. The terror was not about you being too much, but about you being appropriately sized when patterns require partners to be small. About you having self when patterns require partners to abandon self. About you staying intact when patterns work through breaking people into pieces that no longer require anything patterns cannot provide. The staying yourself also meant you recognized when patterns hurt you rather than accepting their framing that your hurt was overreaction, meant you trusted your reality rather than accepting theirs as only reality, meant you knew something was wrong rather than believing their narrative that you were problem. Your maintained self had maintained perception, maintained knowing, maintained capacity to recognize that relationship was damaging you rather than you being too damaged to handle relationship. The maintained capacity to recognize damage terrified them, because recognition leads to leaving, while confusion about who is responsible for damage allows staying. Number 3. You left before they could discard you, which reversed power dynamic they relied on to feel safe. The avoidant is terrified by you because you left before they could discard you, which reversed power dynamic they rely on to feel safe, disrupted script where they maintain control through determining when relationship ends, took from them, the power position that makes leaving feel like choosing, rather than being abandoned. They are accustomed to being person who leaves, or person who makes relationships so intolerable that partner leaves. But partner leaving feels like avoidant pushed partner away, which maintains sense of control. You left while they still wanted you there, while they were not ready for you to leave, while they expected you to keep trying or keep accommodating or keep hoping they would change. Your leaving before they discarded you terrified them, because leaving was supposed to be their move when patterns made continuing impossible, was supposed to be their choice when staying required too much vulnerability, was supposed to happen on their timeline when they felt safe enough to leave or when they felt bored enough to pursue someone new. You leaving when you decided staying was no longer acceptable took control they relied on, reversed abandonment, dynamic where they abandon rather than being abandoned, created situation where they were left rather than being person who leaves. The reversal activated. Abandonment wounds patterns exist to protect against. The leaving also terrified them, because you leaving before they finished with you meant unfinished business. Their psyche cannot process meant rejection. They cannot reframe as their choice meant abandonment. They cannot disguise as them doing the leaving. When they leave or push partner to leave, they maintain narrative that they chose ending, that partner was not right for them, that they are fine alone. When partner leaves before they are ready, the narrative fails. They cannot pretend they chose it. They cannot reframe it as their preference. They have to face being left because patterns made someone choose leaving over staying. The facing terrifies them. Your timing of leaving also meant you retained power they usually take from partners through keeping partners hoping, through intermittent reinforcement that keeps partners attached, through making partners believe if they just accommodate more or wait longer. Eventually, patterns will change. You stopped hoping before hope died completely. You left before exhaustion made leaving impossible. You retained enough self to protect self through leaving, rather than staying until staying destroyed you completely. The retained power meant you won in ways partners usually lose, left on your terms rather than on theirs, protected yourself rather than sacrificing yourself for a relationship that did not deserve sacrifice. Number 4. Your strength exposed their patterns as the problem when patterns depend on appearing reasonable. The avoidant is terrified by you because your strength exposed their patterns as problem when patterns depend on appearing reasonable. When defensive system requires framing their withdrawal as appropriate response to your excessive demands, rather than as dysfunctional response to normal needs. When maintaining patterns relies on positioning their limitations as reasonable boundaries, rather than as inability to sustain intimacy. Your strength made patterns visible as patterns rather than as reasonable responses, made dysfunction visible as dysfunction rather than as justified self-protection, made their inadequacy visible as inadequacy rather than as your excessive expectations. When partner is broken and desperate and accommodating every limitation, avoidant can frame patterns as reasonable responses to partner being too much. The broken partner validates narrative through their desperation, through their excessive pursuing of someone who withdraws, through their intense reactions to patterns that hurt them. Your strength meant you did not become broken or desperate or excessively accommodating. You remained calm while maintaining boundaries. You stayed centered while refusing unacceptable treatment. You appeared reasonable while they appeared unreasonable. The contrast exposed them. Your strength also meant you did not pursue intensely when they withdrew, which removed their ability to claim they withdrew. Because you pursued too intensely, did not react dramatically to their patterns, which removed their ability to claim they employed patterns because your reactions were too dramatic, did not demand excessively, which removed their ability to claim they could not meet demands because demands were excessive. You asked for normal things in normal ways and they could not provide normal things, which made clear problem was their capacity, not your requirements. The clarity terrified them, because clarity removes plausible deniability patterns require. The exposure of patterns through your strength meant others might see patterns too, meant they might have to face. That patterns are problem across relationships, rather than partners being problem in each relationship, meant they might need to address patterns rather than finding more accommodating partner who can be broken into accepting patterns. The potential recognition terrified them. The possible need to change terrified them. Your strength as mirror, showing them clearly what they could deny, when looking at broken partners terrified them. Because seeing meant knowing and knowing meant responsibility. They defend against, through ensuring others appear responsible, through breaking them. Number 5. You refused to accept their reality as the only reality which threatened control they maintained through determining what was real. The avoidant is terrified by you because you refuse to accept their reality as only reality which threatened control they maintain through determining what is real in relationship, through establishing their interpretation as truth and your interpretation as distortion, through making you doubt your perceptions and accept theirs as more accurate. You maintained your reality alongside theirs. You held your interpretation while acknowledging theirs. You trusted your perceptions despite their insistence your perceptions were wrong. The maintained reality terrified them, because maintaining reality meant you could see them clearly, rather than seeing them through distorted lens their framing required. They need partners to accept that avoidant. Withdrawing is partner pursuing too much rather than avoidant being unable to tolerate closeness. That avoidant blaming is partner's behavior. Warranting blame rather than avoidant deflecting from their patterns, that partner's needs are excessive rather than avoidance capacity being limited. The accepting their reality allows patterns to continue, because if reality is that partner is problem, then solution is partner changing, rather than avoidant addressing patterns. You would not accept reality where you were problem. You maintained reality where patterns were problem. The maintained alternative reality threatened their control. Your refusing to accept their reality meant two realities existed in relationship, where they needed only theirs to exist, meant conflict about what was true, rather than agreement that their version was true, meant you acting based on your reality, rather than based on theirs. When you acted from your reality, you set boundaries about their behavior, rather than accepting their framing that your reactions to behavior were problem. You held them accountable for patterns, rather than accepting blame for responding to patterns. You named their dysfunction, rather than accepting narrative that you were dysfunctional for not accepting their dysfunction. The existence of your maintained reality also meant you could leave, based on your accurate assessment of patterns, rather than staying based on their distorted assessment that you were problem. Your reality told you patterns hurt you and would not change, and leaving was protecting yourself. Their reality tried to tell you that you were too sensitive, and patterns were not problem. And leaving was you giving up or being impatient or not loving them enough. Your trusting your reality over theirs meant you left when staying would have required accepting version of events where somehow you were responsible for damage their patterns caused. The trust terrified them, because trust in your own reality makes you unmanageable through reality. Distortion they employ with broken partners who learn to accept avoidance reality as more valid than their own. Number 6, you held them accountable in ways others did not, which prevented escaping consequences through blame. The avoidant is terrified by you because you held them accountable in ways others did not, which prevented them escaping consequences of patterns through blaming you for patterns, through making patterns about your reactions rather than about their actions, through framing damage as mutual rather than as primarily caused by their defensive withdrawal and criticism and emotional unavailability. You maintained accountability even when they deflected. You redirected focus to their behavior, even when they tried focusing on yours. You named their patterns even when they tried naming your reactions as if reactions were problem, rather than patterns causing reactions being problem. They are accustomed to partners accepting blame for avoidance patterns, to people who come to believe their neediness caused withdrawal rather than withdrawal being independent pattern. To relationships where eventually a partner takes responsibility for dynamic that avoidance patterns created. The blame shifting works with partners who doubt themselves, who want relationship enough to accept responsibility if accepting responsibility might improve relationship, who cannot maintain clear perception of causality when avoidant is skilled at distorting causality. You did not accept blame that was not yours. You held them responsible for behaviors that were theirs. The accountability terrified them. Your holding them accountable meant consequences could not be avoided through blame redirection that usually works, meant they had to face that patterns hurt you rather than your sensitivity being problem, meant they had to recognize they made choices that damage relationship rather than relationship failing through mutual incompatibility. The facing and recognizing threatened defensive structure built on avoiding responsibility for damage patterns cause. Challenge self-concept as person whose limitations are reasonable rather than person whose patterns hurt people. Required acknowledgement that change was their responsibility rather than accommodation being your responsibility. The accountability also meant future patterns would face same accountability, which made continuing patterns risky rather than consequence-free. Made maintaining relationship require changing patterns rather than successfully shifting blame for patterns. Created dynamic where they could not continue hurting you without facing that they were person doing hurting. The risk and requirement and facing were what patterns exist to avoid. Your accountability made patterns visible and consequential when patterns depend on being invisible and consequence-free through blame-making hurt partner's fault rather than hurtful patterns effect. Number 7. Your unbreakability proved patterns would not work long-term with anyone strong enough to resist being broken. The avoidant is terrified by you because your unbreakability proved patterns would not work long-term with anyone strong enough to resist being broken, demonstrated that maintaining patterns means only being able to sustain relationships with people weak enough or wounded enough to accept patterns through being broken into accommodation. You represented threat that patterns have inherent limitation. That defensive system works only with broken people. That anyone maintaining self and boundaries and standards would eventually leave rather than accept relationship, where acceptance requires self-abandonment. Previous relationships ending could be explained as wrong, person or bad compatibility, or mutual unsuitability. Your leaving cannot be explained those ways because you were right person who accommodated reasonably and loved well and stayed longer than patterns warranted. The leaving revealed patterns as limiting factor, as feature that makes sustained intimacy impossible, as dysfunction preventing them from keeping people worth keeping. The revelation terrified them because revelation means patterns are problem they need to address rather than partners being problems they need to avoid. Your unbreakability also meant they cannot simply find someone more accommodating, because anyone appropriately accommodating will eventually recognize patterns hurt them and will protect themselves through leaving like you protected yourself. They can find people more easily broken, but people easily broken are people already damaged in ways that make them poor partners. Are people whose brokenness means relationship will be unsatisfying even when accommodation is total. You proved healthy person with boundaries and self and standards will not accept patterns long term. The proof terrified them. The terror comes from facing limited options their unbreakability revealed. They can address patterns through therapy, which feels threatening because vulnerability. They can accept only being able to maintain relationships with broken people, which means accepting relationships will be unsatisfying. They can cycle through relationships that end when strong people leave, which means accepting patterns prevent sustained intimacy with anyone worth having. All options are uncomfortable. Your unbreakability forced recognition that comfortable option where patterns work with healthy partners does not exist. The forced recognition of limited options is what your refusal to be broken created. The terror is their response to seeing clearly what patterns cost them when someone strong makes cost visible. Why your unbreakability was threat. Their defensive system was not designed to handle. Your unbreakability was threat. The avoidance defensive system was not designed to handle, because defensive system evolved to protect against being hurt through intimacy by preventing intimacy from deepening. Protecting against being controlled through obligation by avoiding situations where obligations form. Protecting against being depleted through giving by withdrawing before giving becomes necessary. The system handles these threats through distancing patterns that prevent feared outcomes. Your unbreakability created different threat patterns we're not designed for and could not manage through usual defensive responses. The threat you created was not threat of hurt or control or depletion, but was threat of exposure and accountability and recognition that patterns were problem. Defensive system has no protocol for handling someone who maintains boundaries that cannot be manipulated, maintains self that cannot be eroded, maintains reality that cannot be distorted, maintains accountability that cannot be deflected. The usual defenses make these threats worse. Withdrawing from you made patterns more visible rather than less visible. Blaming you failed when accountability stayed focused on them. Minimizing your needs failed when you knew needs were normal and their capacity was limited. The system malfunction created escalation where they employed patterns more intensely, hoping intensity would break you the way moderate patterns broke others, where they withdrew more extremely. Hoping extreme withdrawal would make you desperate enough to eliminate boundaries, where they blamed more consistently, hoping consistent blame would make you accept responsibility for their patterns. The escalation failed. You remained unbroken. The failure of intensified patterns to achieve what moderate patterns usually achieve revealed limitation of defensive system, showed patterns have breaking point where they stop working, demonstrated that strength cannot be overcome through pattern escalation when strength comes from healthy self-worth rather than from desperate need to make relationship work. Understanding your unbreakability as threat defensive system could not handle protects you from internalizing their escalated patterns as evidence. Something was wrong with you. From believing intensity of their responses meant you were actually too much. From accepting narrative that relationship failing was about your inadequacy rather than about patterns meeting immovable boundaries. The escalation was their panic. The intensity was their terror. The failure was their limitation. Your unbreakability revealed all of this clearly, even while they tried desperately to make breaking. You obscure their patterns as real problem. How you're leaving, before being broken, saved you from years of gradual erosion. Your leaving before being broken saved you from years of gradual erosion that breaks people slowly, from progressive accommodation that eventually makes person unrecognizable to themselves, from incremental self-abandonment that accumulates until no self remains to abandon. You recognized patterns early enough, trusted yourself clearly enough, valued yourself strongly enough to leave before damage became irreversible, before staying cost you more than leaving, before accommodation became so complete that finding yourself again would require years of a therapeutic work to undo damage patterns caused. The gradual erosion breaks people through making each accommodation seem small, through framing each boundary elimination as reasonable compromise, through positioning each standard lowering as necessary adjustment. The accumulation is invisible until person looks back and cannot recognize who they became, realizes boundaries disappeared entirely, discovers standards are non-existent, recognizes self is missing. The broken partners often describe feeling like shell, like going through motions, like no longer knowing who they are beneath accommodations they made. You avoided this fate through leaving while still knowing yourself, while still having boundaries to protect, while still maintaining standards worth keeping. Your leaving before being broken also meant you retained capacity to recognize healthy love when you encounter it, maintained template of what acceptable treatment looks like, preserved self that can engage in reciprocal relationship rather than accommodating one-sided dynamic. Broken partners lose these capacities through having them worn away by patterns, through learning that love means accepting patterns rather than love meaning mutual care, through developing belief that accommodation is normal, rather than that reciprocity is reasonable expectation. You left with capacities intact. The intact capacities mean you can build new relationships from strength rather than from wounds patterns would have created if you had stayed long enough for patterns to break you. The recognition that leaving before being broken saved you validates your choice to leave, when you did, rather than waiting longer. Hoping things would change affirms your trust in yourself. When you recognized continuing meant being destroyed, confirms your priorities were correct when you chose self-preservation over relationship preservation. You saved yourself from future you would have faced if patterns had broken you. That saving is evidence of strength avoidant found terrifying. Wisdom patterns could not overcome. Love for yourself that exceeded any accommodation you might have made for relationship that required your disappearance as price of keeping. Avoidant. Comfortable. Why they will seek more easily broken partners. But find those relationships unsatisfying. The avoidant will seek more easily broken partners after you, but will find those relationships ultimately unsatisfying. Because easily broken partners are easily broken for reasons that make them poor partners, because people who have no boundaries to maintain are people whose lack of boundaries indicates deeper wounds. Because willingness to accept patterns without resistance suggests damage that predates relationship rather than strength that could sustain healthy relationship. The more easily broken the partner, the less satisfying relationship becomes even when patterns face no resistance. Easily broken partners accommodate everything which sounds ideal to avoidant seeking accommodation. But total accommodation creates dynamic, where avoidant cannot respect partner, who has no self-respect, cannot desire partner who has no boundaries, making desire feel like choosing, rather than like being pursued, cannot feel challenged by a partner who challenges nothing, making relationship feel boring, rather than engaging. The easily broken partner also brings their own dysfunction. That made them easily broken brings wounds that create dramatic responses. Patterns can blame, but that also create chaos. Patterns cannot actually handle. Brings neediness that stems from brokenness rather than from reasonable. Needs, patterns might address through growth. The seeking more easily broken partners is attempt to find accommodation you would not provide. Attempt to secure relationship where patterns face no consequences. Attempt to maintain defensive system without system being threatened by strength. Patterns cannot break. But finding easily broken partner means finding unsatisfying relationship, because satisfaction comes from being loved by someone worth being loved by, from being chosen by someone strong enough that choosing means something, from sustaining intimacy with someone healthy enough that intimacy is mutual rather than one-sided accommodation. You are satisfying relationship they destroyed through patterns. Easily broken partners are unsatisfying relationships they maintain through patterns. The contrast will haunt them. Understanding they will seek more easily broken partners, but find those relationships unsatisfying, protects you from believing they will be happier with someone more accommodating, from thinking you a problem, because you would not accommodate enough, from imagining they will find perfect match who accepts patterns you could not accept. The perfect match who accepts all patterns is imperfect person, whose wounds make them accept patterns. Healthy person recognizes as unacceptable. They will find people who stay despite patterns. They will not find satisfaction with people whose staying is evidence of their brokenness rather than evidence of their strength. You staying as long as you stayed was evidence of your strength. Your leaving when patterns threatened to break you was evidence. Strength persisted despite patterns designed to eliminate strength. What it means: that you represented future they could have had if patterns had not prevented having it. You represented future the avoidant could have had if patterns had not prevented having it. Symbolized relationship that could have been satisfying if terror had not made satisfaction feel dangerous. Embodied possibility of sustained intimacy that might have developed if defensive system had not destroyed intimacy to maintain defense. You were not fantasy or idealization, but were real person, offering real love that patterns were inadequate to receive. Were actual relationship working until patterns sabotaged working. Were genuine option for future patterns foreclosed through making keeping you impossible. They recognize in retrospect that you were chance they had at relationship worth having. That losing you was losing best opportunity they may have for a sustained intimacy with healthy partner. That future you offered was future patterns prevented them from accepting, when accepting would have required addressing patterns rather than defending patterns. The recognition is painful because recognition means acknowledging they destroyed something valuable through patterns they continue maintaining, means facing that better future existed and patterns chose current emptiness over that future. Means knowing relationship that could have been satisfying was sacrificed to protect patterns that prevent satisfaction. The you as representation of lost future intensifies regret beyond regretting lost person, because losing person who represented possible future means losing future itself, means recognizing patterns not only cost them you, but cost them possibility you embodied, means facing that continuing patterns guarantees future without intimacy. You represented as achievable if only patterns had not prevented achievement. The lost future becomes specter haunting present where current reality compares unfavorably to potential reality you represented before patterns destroyed potential. Understanding you represented future they could have had protects you from believing you were just another relationship in series of equivalent relationships, from thinking losing you was same as losing previous partners who were more easily broken, from imagining you are replaceable by finding someone similar. You were not just partner, but were possibility of different life, not just relationship, but were potential for sustained intimacy. Not just person, but were future that could have been better than present they maintain through refusing to address patterns. The future was real. The possibility was genuine. The potential was achievable. Patterns prevented all of it. Your leaving was not ending. One option among many, but was closing door on best option. Patterns made unsustainable. Why? Your strength. That terrified them is strength that will protect you in every future relationship. Your strength that terrified the avoidant is strength that will protect you in every future relationship, because strength that maintained boundaries despite manipulation will maintain boundaries against any future manipulation. Strength that prevented self-loss. Despite patterns requiring self-abandonment will prevent self-loss in any dynamic. Requiring self-abandonment. Strength that enabled leaving before being broken will enable leaving any relationship, where staying requires being broken. The strength is not specific to relationship with avoidant, but is inherent quality of character that operates across contexts, is developed capacity that remains available regardless of partner, is integrated self-worth that travels with you into every connection you form. The boundaries you maintained despite avoidant trying to manipulate boundaries away are boundaries that will protect you from anyone attempting similar manipulation, that will alert you early when someone tries eliminating boundaries, that will enable you to leave before patterns can break you regardless of whose patterns are attempting breaking. The self you preserved despite patterns designed to erode self is self that will resist erosion in any relationship where erosion is required, that will recognize when accommodation crosses into self-abandonment, that will prioritize maintaining yourself over maintaining relationship that demands your disappearance. Your capacity to leave before being broken means you will leave future relationships if staying requires being broken, will protect yourself from gradual erosion regardless of who is causing erosion, will trust yourself enough to recognize when relationship is damaging you rather than doubting yourself when partner claims damage is your perception problem. The capacity is protection against not just avoidant attachment, but against any pattern that requires breaking partner to maintain pattern, against any dynamic that demands self-abandonment, against any relationship where keeping relationship costs keeping yourself. Understanding your strength as protection for future validates strength rather than makes you question whether strength was problem, frames unbreakability as asset rather than as liability, positions capacity to leave as healthy boundary rather than as inability to commit. The avoidant framed your strength as too much. The accurate framing is, your strength is appropriately sized for a healthy person with boundaries and self and standards. The strength that terrified them is strength that will serve you, protect you, enable you to build relationships based on mutual respect, rather than on one person accommodating other person's patterns through being broken into accommodation. The ultimate truth about you, being the one person. The avoidant could not break. The ultimate truth is that you were the one person the avoidant could not break, and it terrified them. Because you maintained boundaries they could not manipulate away. Did not lose yourself. Despite patterns designed to require self-abandonment, left before they could discard you, which reversed power dynamic, exposed their patterns as problem through your strength, refused to accept their reality as only reality, held them accountable in ways others did not, and proved through unbreakability that patterns would not work long-term with anyone strong enough to resist being broken. Your unbreakability was threat. Their defensive system was not designed to handle. Created terror patterns could not manage, forced recognition that patterns have limitations, and someone strong reveals limitations rather than accommodating patterns. Your leaving before being broken saved you from years of gradual erosion that breaks people slowly, preserved self that can engage in reciprocal relationships, maintained capacities that broken partners lose through accommodation that becomes identity. They will seek more easily broken partners, but will find those relationships unsatisfying, because easily broken partners are broken, for reasons that make them poor partners, because relationships built on total accommodation lack respect and desire, and challenge that make relationships satisfying. You represented future they could have had if patterns had not prevented having it, symbolized a possibility of sustained intimacy, patterns destroyed, embodied relationship that could have been satisfying if terror had not made satisfaction feel dangerous. Your strength that terrified them is strength that will protect you in every future relationship, is capacity that will enable healthy boundaries across all connections, is self-worth that will prevent future erosion regardless of who attempts erosion. Being terrifying to avoidant through refusing to be broken is success, not failure, is evidence of strength worth keeping rather than evidence of inadequacy requiring fixing, is proof you were healthy enough to recognize patterns hurt you and strong enough to protect yourself through leaving. You were one person. Avoidant could not break. That unbreakability terrified them. That terror is evidence you were strong enough to recognize patterns hurt you and wise enough to protect yourself through leaving and healthy enough to know you deserve partner who does not require you being broken as condition of keeping them. The avoidance terror about your unbreakability is your freedom from needing to stay with someone whose patterns only work with broken people. Stay unbreakable. You broke free from someone who could not break you, and that freedom is what strength created, what boundaries protected, what leaving secured when staying would have cost you the unbreakability that terrified them, because it revealed their patterns as inadequate to keep anyone worth keeping. The terror they felt about your strength is validation, that strength was real, that boundaries were necessary, that leaving was protecting rather than abandoning. You were unbreakable. That unbreakability saved you. Maintain that strength. Protect those boundaries. Trust that capacity to leave when staying requires being broken. The strength that terrified the avoidant is the strength that will ensure you never again stay with anyone whose love requires your destruction as price of their comfort. Your unbreakability is your power. Keep it. You will build life with someone whose strength matches yours, whose boundaries complement yours, whose capacity for intimacy does not require your boundaries disappearing. You were too strong to break. That strength was not weakness. That unbreakability was not failure. Leaving was succeeding at protecting yourself from patterns that required breaking you.